So really glad to be here. I was telling Michael I assigned this seminar as an extra credit point in my interaction design class, so students can watch any of the seminars from the past or in the present and write a little summary of it. And that's been such a great assignment. So it's really great to actually get to be here myself. So as you may know, this is actually a really difficult time for trans people in the US in particular. And so I wanted to begin by highlighting this anti-trans political climate that we are in right now. And I think, when I was giving talks about a year ago, I'm not sure how many people really knew about this stuff, but I feel like it's really front and center right now in a way that I definitely wasn't anticipating. So there was pretty much as soon as the new administration came into office, there was an executive order that was basically kind of defining gender as only being two binary sexes. And these are some of the implications of that order. So recognizing people as only men or women when it's actually quite more complex than that, denying requests for passport gender markers, moving trans women into men's prisons, bans on trans service members in the military, restrictions on gender-affirming care for youth and also in some states for adults, and then barring schools from supporting students who are socially transitioning. And there's always something new going on at the state level. The more recent two things that have happened are in Iowa. They have passed basically restrictions on trans people's rights, making it so that trans people have fewer rights than other people in the state. This is things like bathroom bans, which you may think, it's only a bathroom, that's not that big of a deal, but if you can't use a public restroom, you kind of can't be in public spaces for more than a few hours. So these have really big implications. And then in Texas, this is a new proposed bill. It hasn't been passed yet, but basically it makes it illegal to identify as transgender. And I mentioned some of these consequences before, but of course there's restrictions on travel if you cannot have your passport updated, and then really dire consequences for trans women who are being transferred over to men's jails. And so even though these are only executive orders, that doesn't mean that they are the law. There's a lot of people complying with these orders as though they were law. So there are very real consequences here. And I'm sure many of you have seen this list of words that we are kind of feeling that we're restricted from using these words in grant proposals for academic research. I'm showing these words because I want us to keep saying these words. These are censored in some ways, but I think we need to still say these words, use these words, talk about these things, even if people are telling us we should not. And that's partly why I made this website the other day that kind of just cycles through these words in a random order. It was something I wanted to be able to see myself, so I just put it together very quickly. So all of this is context for the environment in which I've been doing this research. And this is an example of how trans people have been fighting back against this hostile political environment by creating technology, or what I like to call trans technology. So this is an example called the Transformations Project. And this is a website that displays this database of all of the different bills that have been proposed or passed or not passed in different states and in the US more broadly. So it's really hard to keep track of all of these bills. There's just so many of them, and people don't know necessarily which ones are moving forward and which ones are not. So this is a way that you can look up for your particular state what's happening there, or for the country more broadly. And that's just one example of what I've spent the last several years studying and trying to document in this book. I'm really excited for you to read it. It's available free open access on MIT Press's website. There's also physical copies available at bookstores and online. And I want to give a few more examples of some of the technologies that have been responding to this political moment. Now, I did this research a few years ago, but when I was doing the interviews, this was right when some of these state level bills were being proposed and passed in states like Texas and Idaho, Florida. And this is an app called Trans Family Network. And I think this is such a great example of ways that technology can help in moments like this, because basically the way this started was a bunch of people were organizing on Twitter, which was a very different platform at the time, and trying to connect people who needed support with people who could provide support. So for instance, there were some families in states like Texas where they had a trans child who was no longer able to access healthcare. They wanted to be able to go to a different state, but they may have financial costs that they couldn't afford. They may need help with transportation, all kinds of different resources like that. And initially, people were using a spreadsheet, a Google spreadsheet, to coordinate matching people up. But the problem there is that really anyone could access this spreadsheet. And so people were not sure if the people who were offering support were actually safe, if they could trust those people. It just wasn't a really good technological mechanism for that. And so a group of trans women, mostly highly paid, working in Silicon Valley, they also met on Twitter around the political moment and got together and started creating this app. And many of them took about 2 weeks off of work to create this and basically formalize what was happening in the spreadsheet. But with this app, they were able to have a more formalized vetting process, ways of keeping people safe, ways of matching people up with people that could provide support. So I think this is a really exciting example of what trans technology can do as a form of resistance here. And this is another thing we've seen a lot of is visualizations of the US showing which states are more safe, which states have more bills being proposed that are anti-LGBTQ, things like that. So the map on the left, this is just showing the total bills, not necessarily which ones have passed, but the one on the right, which is created by Erin Reed, who's a very prominent trans activist and journalist, she's actually been doing this risk assessment. So she's analyzing all of this data and showing us which states are safe, which ones you really should not travel to if you're trans. So you can see that there are 2 states that she recommends do not travel. That's Texas and Florida. And then there's a little youth map on the lower corner there that shows how safe things are for trans youth. And people have been using this actually to move to different states, move from some of these red states to blue states. There was a survey that showed that about 5% of trans people living in some of these very dangerous states have moved, and way more than that are considering it. Another form of support comes in the form of mutual aid. So this is something called a stream team called Gender Federation. And stream team is something I had no idea what that was until I started this research. But basically, it's a group of people who come together and do live streams to raise funds for people who need support for something. And in this case, this Gender Federation stream team was interested in raising money for people who needed gender-affirming medical care, but also for things like emergency housing costs, things like that. And so this is another way of providing technological support in this moment. And I tend to find some comfort and power from Chase Strangio. He's the first openly trans lawyer who has presented arguments at the US Supreme Court. And this is a quote from his Instagram that reminds me a lot of trans technologies. He says, "We have a profound and powerful ability to care for each other, to share resources and care, create art, and find the blueprints from those that charted these paths long before we got there." So things like sharing resources, creating art, coordinating with other people to support each other. I think that's a lot of what I'm seeing in the world of trans technologies. So there's a concept called trans care, and this comes from Malatino, and he defines this as trans people showing up for each other, supporting each other, helping to address each other's needs in the absence of support from mainstream systems. So one example here would be if one person gets trans surgery and then a friend takes care of them while they're recovering, because often there are not formal resources for things like this. And from trans care, I developed this concept of technological trans care, which is trans people creating innovative technological mechanisms to support each other and address the needs that they and their communities face when mainstream systems and technologies reject or exclude them. So an example here is TransCare Plus. This is a resource website that provides important resources for people. And this trans technology, I would argue, is a form of trans care, but it's different because it's one-to-many rather than being one-to-one. So for something like TransCare Plus, the creator of this website would not necessarily know who all the people are that they're helping, who are accessing this site. So there are many people who are receiving help from that rather than it being kind of a one-to-one interaction. And so technological trans care can be an important way for trans people to fight back against this discriminatory and hostile systems and political environments. So before I go further, I just wanted to acknowledge my collaborators who've worked with me on this work. So this includes students and postdocs and also some of my co-PIs on the grant that's funding some of this. And a book, it comes out with one person's name on it, but it's never actually just a solo process. So although I wrote it myself, a lot of people collaborated with me on some of the work here. And for methods, it was interviews, so over 100 interviews with different creators of trans technologies. For recruitment, we basically started by creating a list of what we were considering trans technologies. And then we did some searching for other ones we may not have heard of. And we started there by contacting people and inviting them for an interview. At the end of each interview, we also asked people for other examples of people that they considered were making trans technology or other technologies that they could think of. So it was a snowball sampling approach there. At the same time, I was also doing a lot of digital ethnography. So that meant I was using a lot of these technologies myself. I was following them on social media, signing up for their email lists, and then really engaging with that content. And then I also attended a conference called the Trans Tech Summit for 2 years in a row. And then for data analysis, it was primarily this reflexive thematic analysis. And one note, most of the participants in this study actually wanted to be identified rather than anonymous. So you will see in this presentation and in the book, I actually use people's real names many times. And that's because that's what they preferred. So there are some cases where I anonymize people when that was their preference. So I've been talking a lot about trans technology, but I haven't yet told you what exactly that is. And I have 2 definitions here, and these come from the interviews. So basically, I asked people how they were conceptualizing trans technology and what they thought it was. And from there, I came up with this first definition, which is a more practical definition. And that's technology that addresses the unique needs and challenges faced by trans people and communities. And it's often designed in response to the lack of trans inclusion in more mainstream technologies. So an example here would be if someone wants a way to track their hormone dosages, and then they create an app to do that. But there's also a more theoretical definition, and this is drawing from trans studies and queer theory. And this is technology that embraces change and or transition, fosters the creation of new trans worlds, and opens up new possibilities for what technology means and what it can do. And I will give you some examples later in the talk of what I mean here. So here's just a few examples of some of the technologies in the data set. And some of these are more standard apps and websites, but there are also things like AR and VR, prosthetics, different types of supplies, even things like podcasts, things like that. So it definitely was not just digital technologies. It was a much wider range of types of technology. And along with technological trans care, there was another key theme that was going throughout the study and across the book, and this is ambivalence. And trans technologies are really wrapped up in ambivalence. So this means that several seemingly incompatible things can actually be true at the same time. So trans tech creators navigated tensions between competing emotions, goals, and desires that they experience simultaneously. So this included things like individualist and community-based design methods. And I'm using and here instead of versus to demonstrate this ambivalence. Privileged and inclusive technology design, capitalist and anti-capitalist approaches, and then utopian and dystopian trans futures. So I want to give you an example of what I mean here by ambivalence. So I was on Twitter in early 2022, and I came across this tweet by Sasha Winter, who was one of the people I interviewed for this study. And she was announcing something called the Trans Rage Jam. And basically, this was a moment where a lot of people were very angry about this legislation, all of this anti-trans sentiment that was coming through at that time. And they wanted to do something about it. And a game jam is another thing. I didn't know what that was until I started this study, but it's basically a bunch of people coming together, creating their own games on a certain theme. So for this one, the theme is trans rage. And you can see it has a color scheme. It has certain fonts that go with it. And then the people actually work together within an online community that Sasha was also running as part of a Discord server. So basically they could do some of this collaboratively. And this is what they came up with. There were 82 submissions. You can see that they all are on this similar color scheme. They're all using these types of fonts and these themes of anger and rage. But then a few months later, I was back on Twitter. I saw that Sasha had posted another tweet. And this one was announcing the Trans Joy Jam. And this was just a few months later. It was summer of the same year. And you can see the color scheme is completely different. It's involving a rainbow and sparkles and things like this. And here are the submissions that came in for the Trans Joy Jam. You can see they are all much more bright and colorful. The themes are, happy things, including joy. And what I want to really emphasize here is that these are both existing at the same time within the same people. So it's not that this group of trans people was just so angry and enraged in March and April, and then a few months later over the summer, they were just suddenly filled with joy. It's that both of these things exist at the same time within these people. So from there, I want to go into the primary arguments in the book. And the first is that creating trans technology can be powerful and empowering because tech creators have this agency to create the tools that they themselves and their communities as well need to navigate the world. But when trans communities are not involved in design processes, then this can lead to this overly individualistic design that then speaks to more privileged trans people's needs. And so I argue that trans tech creation can actually have the most impact and best address trans needs if diverse trans communities are meaningfully involved in design processes. So in this first part, I'm arguing that creating trans tech can be really powerful and empowering because of this agency people have to create these tools for themselves and their communities. And so a lot of times people are really drawing from their own experiences very directly when creating technology. And this can be really powerful because creators are using their skills that they have, they're using their agency to build something that society is not providing to them. And so this can be a form of technological trans care where people are increasing agency not just for themselves, but for community members as well. And the first example I want to give of this is Erin Reed's informed consent hormone replacement therapy map. So informed consent is a method of medical care where basically you don't need to get a letter from a psychiatrist or from a doctor. You can just say, I want this medical care, and these providers will allow you to have it. And so Erin was really drawing from her own experience here. She said, I was 30 and was trying to find a hormone therapy clinic and didn't know if I could find one. My struggles definitely made me realize, is there really not a place where I can just go online and look for the nearest informed consent location to me? No, there wasn't. It didn't exist at all. And so just in dealing with those frustrations, I wanted to make this one day. I wanted to make sure that people don't have to go through this one day. So here she's really exercising her own agency to create this online resource that can help lots of other trans people all across the US and even beyond, and help them move forward in their medical transition journeys. And so by drawing from her own experiences and basically creating what she wanted to see in the world, she was extending this technological transcare to the people that were accessing the map. And next, I want to tell you about Anna. So Anna was, it's a pseudonym for a participant who wanted to remain anonymous. And she was a young trans girl living in a rural area of the US. And when she was 8 years old, she actually created her own personal website. But beyond that, she was also identifying problems that other trans people were facing, and she wasn't satisfied just waiting around for solutions. So she said, I came out when I was 8, and very few trans resources whatsoever were around. So there was this huge need. I didn't feel supported, so I would need an online resource. There were also thousands of other young trans people who would need that online resource too. So I worked with some friends that I knew from the internet, and we started this educational resource for trans young people. I'm one of the 2 co-founders. We were both 16-year-old trans girls at the time. We didn't know how big it was going to grow or how long it was going to last, and it's still running strong. And so her experience here creating this educational resource when she was a teenager, it just shows this agency that a lot of trans people do have to create the tools that they want to see in the world. And so Anna is someone that had the skills and resources. She knew how to code as a very young person, but she also did have some limitations. So she lived in a very rural area of the US and didn't have very high-speed internet access, but still she was able to make this work. The next example I want to give is actually sort of local to here. It's a group called We Are the Ones We've Been Waiting For. And they're a trans collective in Oakland, California. They're focused on art, music, community, but their big thing is really mutual aid and social justice. And so they created this self-defense kit, basically. They call this part of the program Arm the Girls. So you can see what was involved in the self-defense kit there. And they created and distributed hundreds of these self-defense kits. And this is a way to really directly address community needs. So one of the biggest community needs is safety. And this is especially true for trans feminine people of color. So this is a way that they were really just saying, here's a problem that exists in our community, and here's a way that we are going to help address it. And so the second part of my argument here is that when trans communities are not involved in design processes, this can lead to overly individualistic design that can speak primarily to more privileged trans people's needs. So in many cases, people were creating technologies that were for people that had identities very similar to the creator themselves. And the majority of trans tech creators do tend to be people who are white. They tend to be pretty highly educated. They tend to be of higher socioeconomic status than the overall trans community. And so that means that the needs and desires of the people who are creating technology are not always very well aligned with the trans population more broadly. So there's this potential for trans technologies to actually exclude the most marginalized people in the trans community, and that includes people of color, trans people with lower socioeconomic status, things like that. So the first example I want to give here is, this is a site called Shinigami Eyes, and it's a browser extension that highlights transphobic and trans-friendly pages on a web browser using different colors. So you can see that everyday feminism is in green there. That means it's a safe tool a safe site or page for trans people. And then something like the Family Research Council is in red, and that's something that's considered anti-trans. And there's also a crowdsourced mechanism here where you can, if you have this browser extension, you can actually mark things as safe or not safe yourself. And so according to their website, the creator, who is a trans person themselves, was really creating this tool in response to their own experience of being a trans person online and not knowing which sites they could trust. And I wasn't able to speak with this creator. I did reach out to them, but didn't receive a response. So basically, all I know about this tool is what I'm able to read online. And in the FAQs, it says, how does it know how to color each page? And the answer is, the initial version has been created through a mix of manual labeling and machine learning, but you can contribute your own labels. And so I started to notice a lot of people on Twitter talking about this tool. And this person says that they had installed Shinigami Eyes and noticed a couple things. So first, I immediately noticed how many Black trans folks and Black trans allies are not marked safe, but how many blatantly racist folks are. And then they continued and said, if you're not safe for Black trans people, you're not safe for trans people. So in the little that I know about how this tool was created, and I actually don't know the identity of the person who created it, but they did this manual labeling process, and it sounds like it was just them maybe doing this on their own. So if they did have biases, then that could have crept into the design of the initial machine learning algorithm. And so the result then is that it's more likely to mark white trans people as safe, more likely to mark trans people of color or Black trans people as not safe. And so then there's also this crowdsourcing process, but we don't know who all is involved in that crowdsourcing process. And so it might have been that that then perpetuated some of these biases as well. So a better approach would be to start out with the initial labeling of the data set with a diverse group of trans people so that you could build the machine learning model based on a less biased data set. And this next example is the creator of a very formative trans resource site. And she was a white trans woman, and she was actually very forthright with me about her motivations in building the site, primarily for other people that were just very similar to herself. She said, I wanted to help the people who are kind of like me, who are college educated, competitive in white collar fields. So that was my grand scheme. I was trying to make it for everybody, but I was really focused on people who I was most easily able to help. So in this quote, if you read between the lines, it sounds like that there is some judgment here towards trans people who are not like her, so people who are not college educated and white. And it feels like there's this harmful assumption here that more marginalized people, and that's likely inherent in the website itself. And so because she is creating this site and maintaining this site from this more privileged frame of reference, then it does have the potential to exclude or to not include resources that are most helpful for trans people who are not like her, so people who are not white, well-educated, and affluent. And then the next example is a site called the Digital Transgender Archive. And this is an online archive of trans content, but it does tend to skew more towards content of mostly white trans people. But the creator of this tool was actually a lot more self-aware and was thinking a lot about how his privilege and the privilege of the team who created the site might shape the tools and might bake in things like bias and exclusion. So he said, we're recognizing the ways that the Digital Transgender Archive is slanted towards otherwise privileged factions of trans communities in ways that you can probably readily anticipate. I'm sure that the DTA doesn't always feel like everyone's resource. So it was actually really refreshing when I was speaking to creators who explicitly acknowledged some of the limitations and described ways that they were thinking about trying to address some of these limitations, because most of the creators I spoke with were just leaving this unstated and unaddressed. But there are ways to move beyond these more individualistic design processes. And so in the third part of my argument, I argue that trans technology creation can have most impact and best address trans needs if diverse community members are meaningfully involved in design processes. So this first example is something called the Creative Futures Project. And this is a project in which the creator worked with 3 trans youth to create virtual reality art for immersive storytelling. And it eventually became 2 different films. So the creator, Dylan Pare, said the linear film would tell the story of how these youth came up with their ideas of what stories they wanted to tell and what they were hoping people would learn from their projects. And then the 360 film was where you can actually go into the art with them. They tell you about their art that they've created and what that means to them. So this is a way that Pare was able to tell diverse trans stories using this innovative medium. And at the same time, they were also teaching VR skills to young people. And then this next example, this is actually a HCI researcher in Brazil named Guilherme Pereira. And he was using participatory design methods over a period of more than 6 months with a group of trans and queer people in Brazil. And they ended up creating this app called LGB Trust, which is trying to increase safety in physical spaces for trans and queer people in Brazil. And so in this human-centered design process, Pereira was learning with participants that safety was a primary concern and that they wanted the app to focus on safety primarily. He said this is very deeply related to all these concerns about violence in Brazil. So it was natural to talk about and to think about safety, how to create a safe place, to share about what places you should be careful, where you should not go. But it was not given by me. It was not my choice at the beginning. It was just the natural development of the project. And so he went into this process not knowing what the app was going to focus on. But in the workshops, along with participants, they decided that they really would be focusing on safety for this app. But there is an important tension here. So despite this empowering and potentially liberatory possibilities of trans technology, many of these technologies were not actually deployed or were short-lived. So this was especially true for those that use these more exemplary human-centered design processes. And a lot of times this happened most often in academic spaces. So I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with this. We have a lot of incentive in academia to create technologies, to design them, but not necessarily to deploy and maintain them. And this is exactly what happened in the case of LGB Trust. So Pereira was describing to me the barriers to deploying it, and he said that he kind of deployed the app, but it was like a prototype deployment. I had most of these functionalities working so people could ask for help, people could post things, it would appear in the map, and people could ask for any other kind of support. I think that in the end, and this is something that really frustrated me at the time, for you to be able to deploy an app, you need a lot of money and you need a lot of people working with you. So this was a safety app, so it really needed to work really well without any issues if it was actually going to keep people safe. And so it was quite disappointing for the researcher and also for the people who were involved in the study that the app was not fully deployed. And so as a recap of my primary arguments here, creating trans technology can be powerful and empowering because tech creators have this agency to create the tools that they and their communities need to navigate the world. But then when trans communities are not involved in the design process, this can lead to this overly individualistic design that speaks primarily to more privileged trans people's needs. And so I argue trans tech creation can be most impactful and best address trans needs if we have diverse community members who are meaningfully involved in design process. So what should we do about it? How can we address some of these inequalities that occur when design is more overly individualistic? So this is kind of how I've been thinking about moving towards more community-based tech deployment and maintenance rather than just design. So this dark gray circle here, this is people who really understand community needs and values. And that is basically diverse trans communities in this case. And then the next circle is people who really have the skills, resources, and interest to design technology. And that would be the creators of trans technology that I spoke with in this study. And there is overlap between that and the diverse trans communities. But then there's this third circle here at the bottom, which is people who have the skills and the resources and the interest to deploy and maintain technology. And that is the one that doesn't as often come into these trans tech design processes. And as far as I know, there are actually very, very few trans technologies that are at the center of this circle. And that leaves quite a few gaps. And so this is a small excerpt from a long list of categories of trans challenges that my research team and I came up with in participatory research with communities. And so the first column here is types of trans technologies that currently address this challenge. So if we look at the second row here, there's a lot of challenges around access to documents, things like passports and driver's licenses, and being able to change one's name and gender marker on those. But as far as I know, there are not any trans technologies that are currently working in this space. And so the second column here is ways that trans technologies can help address this challenge to some extent. So we could think about digital systems to help people change their names and gender markers on these identification documents, or even just resources for how to do that. And then the third column here is aspects that are not possible to fully address with technology, so more systemic issues. So there's things like transphobia and racism, and we're never going to be able to actually solve any of these systemic problems with a technology. And so I tend to talk about this more as helping to address challenges rather than offering solutions to these challenges, because there are always parts of it that we can't actually do here. I think that also applies to things like policies and some of these really harmful legislation that is coming out. And so there's a mismatch here. And that is that people are mostly designing based on their own needs. So they're not starting from this place of examining what the community needs are. And so that's the reason why we don't have any document-related trans technologies. But we do have, for instance, a trans banking app, which is something that nobody asked for. Okay, so a little pause before I get to the conclusion. So just pause, take a deep breath, try not to think about the state of the world. So as I start to wrap up here, I want to leave you with this primary takeaway. So trans technologies really show how technology can help us imagine new possibilities for trans people and communities. And then at the same time, trans experiences can help us imagine new possibilities for technology. So in this first category, I told you about this example of trans family network. And this is a way that trans technologies help people in unique ways that they may not have considered. So, initially people were using a spreadsheet for this, but now we have a technology that can do this much more in a much better way. Another example of this is something called Mod Club, which is a online community and resource sharing, photo sharing community for mostly people on the transmasculine spectrum. And then at the same time, there are ways that trans experiences help us imagine new possibilities for technology. So this is a really cool example. This is also coming from some HCI researchers. And this is a series of facial prosthetics that enable you to have multiple identities using Apple Face ID. So if you think about unlocking your iPhone, you do that using your face. And since each of us only has one face, we can only have one identity on our iPhone. But you can imagine in things like gender transition that you might need to have multiple identities at the same time. And a way to do that is to have these facial prosthetics. So this was a participatory design project where they worked with community members to create some of these technologies, test them out, things like that. And they started to realize that it wasn't just useful for trans experiences on iPhone, it was also really useful for assisting surveillance in public spaces. So if you think about a lot of cities have cameras surveilling you in public spaces, a lot of people would like to obfuscate that. And these facial prosthetics ended up being a way to do that as well. So it came out of the context of thinking about trans experiences, but it went far beyond that. And then this is one of my favorite examples. This is Chelsea Manning. She's a famous whistleblower, and she was in prison for a number of years for that. And when she was in prison, she was transitioning, and nobody knew what she looked like as a woman, basically. And there was a magazine that wanted to do a feature on Chelsea. They wanted to have a photographer to take pictures of her, but that was not allowed in the prison. And so the magazine reached out to an artist named Heather Dewey Hagborg, who is an artist that does DNA phenotyping work. And I was able to talk with Heather as one of the interviewees in this study. And she told me about this collaborative process with Chelsea, where Chelsea sent Heather basically hair clippings, cheek swabs, different things like this so that she could use her DNA. And Heather then created all of these different potential versions of what Chelsea might look like. And they called this project Probably Chelsea. And so they were able in the computer code to get rid of all of the potential options that would be male versions of Chelsea and only have it so that it was either female or gender neutral versions. And so this is what it ended up looking like. This is Chelsea after she got out of prison, coming face to face with this art exhibit. So I think this is a really cool example of very innovative, very unique ways that we can use technology that comes from thinking about trans experiences, but goes very far beyond that. And so I want to end on an optimistic note. And I want to read this short excerpt from the book that I think demonstrates my optimism, especially in the face of these very difficult times. So as we continue to search for ways to emerge from the toxic climate that trans people are currently forced to inhabit, we can set our sights on trans technologies on the horizon and start to build those technologies that help us escape transphobic worlds. I personally tend toward a more optimistic utopian view. I have immense hope for those 16-year-olds sitting in their bedrooms in their parents' houses or in libraries or in youth drop-in centers, hacking at their keyboards to create browser extensions, those vast armies of trans game creators channeling their rage and creativity into trans game jams, and all those people building new technologies to help address the challenges their community faces. Each of these creators are ripples extending out from earlier trans technologies that have inspired them. And at the same time, there are also new objects breaking the surface, and they will inspire waves of future trans technologies spreading out across the water toward the horizon. Thank you.